there, I'm back again. Are you ready to finish this story? Let's find where we were. When we last left off, we had interviewed the Paxtons, and we had also met Elsie Warden. And we had a bit of an odd encounter. It seems like she bled when the police officer fell into her. Alright, so let's see how this story concludes. Mal Travers was buried in the churchyard the following day. Many turned out for his funeral, despite his reputed failings as a human being, for in a village such as Underbury, a funeral served a greater social purpose than that represented by the mere interment of a body. It was an opportunity to exchange information, to gather, and to speculate. As Burke looked around the graveside, he could see faces familiar to him from his brief time in the village. The Wardens were there, the family making its dislike of Burke clear only through hostile glances in his direction rather than outright force. So too were the Allinsons and the Paxtons. As the ceremony concluded, Burke saw Emily Allinson leave her husband, who made his way over to join Burke and Stokes. Miss Allinson walked by the wall of the cemetery, staring out over the fields toward the spot where Mal Travers had died. She exchanged a few words with Elsie Warden as she passed her by, and they both looked for a moment in Burke's direction and laughed before going their separate ways. Miss Paxton seemed to be keeping her distance from both of them, but Emily Allinson cornered her and laid a hand on her arm, a gesture simultaneously intimate and somehow threatening, for it effectively held Miss Paxton in place while the tall, elegant Miss Allinson leaned down to talk to her. "What do you think that's about, sir?" asked Stokes. "A little friendly greeting, perhaps." "Doesn't look too friendly to me." "No, it doesn't, does it? Perhaps we need to have another chat with Miss Paxton." By now, Allinson was almost upon them. "Any progress on your investigation?" he said. "Slow and steady," said Burke, who felt a sudden stab of guilt as he recalled the appearance of the doctor's wife in his dream. "I hear you stirred up the Wardens. They've spoken about our visit. The mother has spoken of little else. She seems to think you're somewhat improper in your manner. She's suggesting that someone ought to teach you a lesson. Any candidates for the role? No shortage, apparently. The Warden family is large, extended, and very male. I'd watch my back if I were you, Inspector." I have Sergeant Stokes here to watch my back," said Burke. "It leaves me free to watch other people." Allinson grinned. "Good. I'm rather hoping that you won't have any reason to call on my services in a personal capacity." "You know," said Burke, "I'm rather hoping that too. Tell me, does your wife know a little of medicine? Many doctors' wives do. Miss Allison is trained as a midwife, and her skills now extend considerably beyond that. She can't practice medicine, of course, but she knows what to do in the event of a crisis. The women of Underbury are fortunate to have her, then. Very fortunate indeed." The rest of the day added little to the sum of knowledge accumulated by the two policemen. With the help of Constable Waters, they completed their questioning of all those who had been present at the inn on the night of Mal Travers' death, and began talking to many of those who were not present. While few had a good word to say about the dead man, there was nothing to link them to the events of the night, and by the time evening came, Burke's natural silence had deteriorated into sullenness. He bid Waters a curt good night, paused for a time to exchange some words with his sergeant, and then ascended to his bedroom, where he remained seated on his bed for the rest of the evening, rising only to receive his supper at the door. In time he must have fallen asleep, for the room was darker than he remembered when he opened his eyes, and the inn was quiet. He was not even aware of why he had awoken until he heard voices speaking softly beneath his window. Burke left his bed and walked to the glass, concealing himself in the shadow as best he could. Two women stood in the yard below, and in the dim light filtering from the inn he could make out the faces of Emily Allinson and Miss Paxton. The woman appeared to be arguing, for all he could see Miss Allinson's fingers stabbing the air before the smaller, darker Miss Paxton. Burke could not make out their words, but then Miss Allinson abruptly walked away. Some seconds later, Miss Paxton followed, but by then Burke was already on his way downstairs. He left the inn, moved through the yard, and soon found himself following the two women along the road that led out of the village. They were heading toward the Paxton house, but as soon as Miss Paxton caught up with Miss Allinson, they left the road and made their way across the fields. They seemed to be heading for the place in which Mal Travers died, until Burke saw them reach a small gate in the fence, open it, and move toward the wall of the churchyard. The inspector kept low as best he could, aided by the clouds that obscured the moon. He was almost at the gate when the woman stopped and turned to face him. "Welcome, Inspector," said Miss Allinson. She did not look surprised to see him. In fact, Burke thought she looked rather pleased, and he knew then that he had stepped firmly into the trap they had set for him. Miss Paxton said nothing, but kept her head down, unwilling even to look in his direction. Burke heard footsteps approaching from behind. He turned to see Elsie Warden moving slowly through the grass, her hands brushing the tips of the weeds as she walked. She stopped when she was some 20 feet from him. Miss Paxton in turn moved away from Miss Allinson, so that Burke found himself in the centre of a triangle formed by the three women. "Is this how you finished off Maltravers?" he asked. "We never laid a hand on Maltravers," said Miss Allinson. "We didn't have to," said Elsie. Burke tried to keep turning, always holding two women in his sight and hoping that he might be fast enough to prevent an attack by the third. "I suspect there are wounds on your chest, Miss Warden," said Burke. "And on my scalp," she said. "He fought back. He always was quick with his hands, was Mal. So you attacked him." "In a manner of speaking," it was Miss Allinson. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "Oh," said Miss Allinson, "but you will." Burke felt the ground shift slightly beneath his feet. He leapt away, fearful of plummeting into some terrible depths. Over by the cemetery wall, fragments of stone shot a foot into the air, leaving gaping holes where they once lay. He heard a howling sound like wind rushing through a tunnel, and then something scratched his face, opening parallel wounds across his cheek and nose. He stumbled backward, raising his arms to protect himself, and watched as the front of his coat was torn open by unseen claws. He smelled foul breath. Thought for a moment that he caught a disturbance in the air, as of heat rising from summer ground. Slowly, its form became clearer, allowing Burke to see, however indistinctly, the shape of breasts and hips. Faced with a target, Burke struck. He pounded his fist into the figure before him. There was slight resistance before his fist passed through it, but he saw Emily Allinson's head jerk backward. Blood spurted from her nose. Burke tried to punch again, but he was attacked from behind before he could do so. His scalp was torn apart, and he felt liquid warmth upon his neck. He tried to rise, but his right hand was wrenched away from him and forced into the air. A sharp pain ran through 3 of his fingers, and the impression of teeth appeared upon the skin of his knuckles. Over by the fence, he saw Elsie Warden's teeth gritted. Elsie shook her head furiously. The pain increased, and the fingers were severed from Burke's hand. His eyes closed, and he prepared to die. Then from somewhere in the darkness he heard a booming sound, and a familiar voice said, "That'll be enough now." Burke's eyelids felt heavy, and blood dripped from the lashes when he finally managed to force them open. Sergeant Stokes stood by the cemetery wall, and he held a shotgun in his hands. "You took your bloody time," thought Burke. He caught sight of a disturbance in the air once again, moving quickly towards Stokes. Once again it seemed to him to approximate the shape of a woman. Its body was blackened, and long fair hair trailed behind it as it crawled along the ground to attack Stokes. He tried to warn his sergeant, but no words came. Instead, his own head was pulled back by the hair, and he felt teeth upon his neck. Stokes saw the presence when it was almost upon him. Instinctively, he swung the shotgun around and fired. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Emily Allinson's mouth opened, and a great gush of red poured from it. She rocked upon her feet, and the front of her green dress darkened. Burke heard a scream that seemed to come from the ground beneath him, echoed in turn by Elsie Warden. His hair was released, and he fell to the dirt, a weight upon his back as he was used as a stepping stone by an unseen presence. Burke's left hand reached out and grasped a rock upon the ground. With the last of his strength, he rose up and straddled the thing, bringing the rock down with all the force that he could muster upon its head. He could feel it moving beneath him, although he saw it only as a shimmering in the air. The stone hit its target, and it spasmed beneath him. Behind him, Elsie Warden's skull cracked, her eyes rolled back on her head, and she fell down dead. Stokes was running toward him now, reloading the shotgun as he came. He was watching Miss Paxton, but she was retreating from them, her face a mask of horror and disgust. She turned from them and ran across the fields, making for the little cottage that she shared with her husband. Stokes shouted after her, warning her to stop. "Let her go," said Burke. "We know where to find her." And then he sank back to the ground, unconscious. Summer came, and the streets grew bright with the plumage of women. The two men met in a bar close to Paddington. It was quiet, the lunchtime drinkers now departed, and the evening crowd yet to arrive. One man was thinner and perhaps a little younger than the other, and wore a glove on his right hand. His companion placed 2 beers on the table before them, then took a seat against the wall. "How was the hand, sir?" asked Stokes. "It hurts a little still," said Burke. "It's odd. I can feel the ends of my fingers, even though they're no longer there. Strange, don't you think?" Stokes shrugged his shoulders. "To tell the truth, sir, I don't know any more what's strange and what isn't." He raised his glass and took a long draught. "You don't have to call me sir any longer, you know," said Burke. "Doesn't seem natural calling you anything else, sir," said Stokes. "I do miss being called sergeant, though. I'm trying to get the missus to call me it, just so I can hear it again, but she won't agree." "How is the bank?" "Quiet," he said. "Don't care much for it, to be honest, but it keeps me busy. The money helps, though." "Yes, I'm sure it does." They were silent then, until Stokes said, "You still think we did right, not telling them what we saw?" The two men had not met in many months, but they had never been ones to dance around a subject of concern to them. "Yes," said Burke, "they wouldn't have believed us, even if we had. Miss Allinson had my blood and skin and her nails, and the bite marks on my hand matched those of Elsie Warden. They attacked me. That's what the evidence said, and who were we to disagree with the evidence?" "Killing women," said Stokes. "I suppose they had no choice but to send us on our way." "No, I suppose they didn't." Burke looked at his former sergeant and laid his good hand upon the older man's arm. "But never forget, you didn't kill women. You never fired at a woman, and I never struck one. Let your conscience be clear on that score." Stokes nodded. "I hear they let the Paxton woman go," he said. "She supported our story. Without her testimony, it would have gone much harder on us. Doesn't seem right, though. She wished a man dead. I don't think she expected that wish to come true, and I don't believe that she wanted a part of what the other women were offering. She was weak, but she did nothing wrong. Nothing that we can prove, at any rate." Stokes took another draught from his glass. "And that poor beggar, Allinson." "Yes," said Burke, "poor Allinson. The doctor had taken his own life in the weeks that followed the incidents at Underbury. He had never uttered a word of blame towards Stokes or Burke for the part they played in his wife's death. Burke spent most of his waking hours thinking about that night, juggling facts with suspicions, but never able to make them fit to his satisfaction in a cohesive theory. A village depleted of its men, the arrival of a strong woman, Miss Allinson, from outside, the threat posed to Elsie Warden and, perhaps, Miss Paxton by Maltravers, and the response to that threat, which had led to Trevor's death and the subsequent attack on Burke and Stokes. Burke had not yet been able or willing to put a name to that response. He now knew more about the Underbury Witches and their leader, Ellen Drury, burned as she hanged. Possession, the term that Stokes had used in the aftermath, was one possibility, but it seemed inadequate to Burke. To him, it was something more. He believed with all his heart that it came from within the 3 women, not solely from outside force, but then he would have been the first to admit that he had never enjoyed a great understanding of the fairer sex. They finished their drinks, then parted on the street with vague promises to meet again, although both men understood that they would not. Burke walked in the direction of Hyde Park, while Stokes stopped at a flower wall to buy some carnations for his wife. Neither saw the small, dark-haired woman who stood in the shadows of a lane, watching them closely. The air shimmered around her as though distorted by the summer heat, and a faint smell of roasting meat could be scented by passersby. Miss Paxton made her choice, and slowly began to follow Burke toward the park. And that is where we end. I hope you enjoyed the story. I know it was a little bit creepy. Didn't necessarily paint witches in a pretty light, but it did show them as powerful, and it's definitely interesting. It's raining outside, so I think I will just let you listen to those sounds as you fall asleep. I hope you enjoyed the story, and let me know